Welcome to Detective Duo, where classic mysteries come alive, from quiet villages to secret meetings with Tommy and Tuppence themselves. Do remember to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The post arrived late that morning, flopping through the brass slot with a thud that startled the silence of the Beresford sitting room. Tuppence looked up from the crossword spread across her lap, her pen mid-air. "Bills, circulars or doom, Tommy," she said. "Place your bets." Tommy, half hidden behind the Times, lowered the paper just far enough to raise an eyebrow. Given the state of our finances, all three seemed possible. She chuckled and crossed to the small writing table where Hannah, their housekeeper, had left the Morning Post in an uneven stack. Sunlight pressed through the lace curtains, glinting on the silver letter opener that Tuppence had once used, rather unsuccessfully, as a hairpin. The top envelope bore the familiar type of the electric company. The next, a crisp charity appeal. But the third, cream-coloured, faintly scented, made her pause. "Now this," she murmured, turning it over, "isn't the hand of a man who wants money." Tommy looked up, nor a woman asking for it by the look of your expression. She hesitated, frowning. "It's my handwriting." Tommy blinked. "Your what?" She held the envelope out. The script was indeed hers, elegant loops and decisive strokes, the sort she used only when she meant business. The address, Mrs. Tuppence Beresford, The Laurels, Camden Road, London, was exact to the comma. Even the slant of the B was identical. Tommy stood and took it from her. "You're sure you didn't write it to yourself in a fit of sentimentality?" "Don't be absurd." She slit it open with the letter opener and drew out a single folded sheet. Her pulse quickened. The paper was smooth, heavy, and perfumed faintly with lilac. One line, written in the same unmistakable hand, stared back at her. "I remember everything now." Below, the signature, Margaret. Tuppence's brow furrowed. "Margaret who?" Tommy leaned over her shoulder. "You don't know?" "No." She turned the sheet over, blank. "And yet it looks as though I wrote it myself. That's the uncanny part." He studied her face. "Well, you always said you had a double somewhere, living a far more glamorous life." "Yes, but I never expected her to correspond with me." They shared a small, uneasy laugh. The sound felt thin against the hush that followed. Hannah entered then, her sturdy shoes squeaking faintly on the parquet. "Excuse me, madam. The milkman says—" "Oh, are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," Tuppence said briskly. "Hannah, you've handled our post for years. Ever recall anything addressed to someone called Margaret?" The housekeeper frowned in thought. "Not lately, though I do remember, must be 5 years ago now. A postcard come here for a Mrs. Margaret Beresford. I thought it was one of them spelling mistakes and passed it to you." Tuppence blinked. "You did? And I laughed and said if I had a namesake, she was welcome to pay the gas bill. But I never thought—" She stopped. Tommy exchanged a glance with her. "So, our mysterious Margaret has form." Hannah hovered by the door, clearly reluctant to leave. "You don't think someone's using your name for, well, not for wickedness, I hope?" Tuppence smiled faintly. "If they are, they could at least be tidier about it." After Hannah withdrew, she laid the letter flat on the table. "Look at the ink," she said. "Fountain pen. Slight smudge at the tail of the dew, the same way I do when I'm writing too quickly." Tommy bent closer. "Postmark, London, yesterday evening. If it's an imposter, they're local." "And if it isn't?" "Then you've developed a second personality with excellent penmanship." She gave him a look that had quelled many a witness in their earlier days. "Tommy, this is serious. Suppose someone's trying to draw us into something, or—" her eyes narrowed, "or knows something we've forgotten." He smiled wryly. "Between your memory and mine, that covers a considerable range." Tuppence turned back to the window. Outside, a delivery boy whistled down the street, the sound ordinary and cheerful, the world unchanged. Yet the small sheet of paper on the table seemed to tilt reality just slightly off balance. After lunch, she couldn't leave it alone. She kept glancing at the letter where it lay beside the biscuit tin. "There's something about that phrase," she said finally. "I remember everything now. It sounds like the end of a confession." Tommy, who was attempting to repair the radio, murmured, "Or the start of blackmail." She shot him a look. "Really, Tommy?" "Darling, You married me for my pessimism. But later, as the shadows lengthened, she caught him studying the envelope himself, his brow furrowed in thought. That evening, when Hannah brought in tea, the faint fragrance of lilac drifted again from the table. "It's stronger now," Tuppence said, sniffing the air. "Maybe the perfume's seeping out of the paper," Tommy offered. "Or maybe it wasn't perfume," she murmured. "Perhaps it was something else, something meant to remind me." He glanced at her sharply. "Remind you of what?" "I don't know." She rose, restless, and began pacing the room. The clock ticked deliberately, each second distinct. On the mantel, the photograph of their younger selves, smiling in Major Carter's office during the war, caught the firelight. They had been partners then in more than marriage, a pair of cheerful meddlers chasing adventure, but now the air of domestic safety felt paper-thin. Tommy stood, tucking the letter into an envelope sleeve. "All right. Tomorrow we pay a call to the post office and see what we can learn about where it was posted. Maybe the clerk remembers the sender." Tuppence nodded, grateful for the plan. Yet she couldn't shake the faint tug of familiarity the name Margaret stirred. That night, lying awake beside Tommy's steady breathing, she found herself whispering the words aloud. "I remember everything now." The phrase seemed to echo faintly through the room, as though someone else had whispered it back. When morning came, she felt oddly relieved to see ordinary daylight. Over breakfast, she teased Tommy about his toast-burning habits until laughter returned between them. But beneath the banter, a thread of unease persisted, light as spider silk, impossible to see, impossible to break. At 11, they walked to the small post office on Camden Road. The postmistress, a plump woman with sharp eyes, examined the envelope under the glass partition. "Posted from the British Museum kiosk yesterday, about 3:30, she said. "We only collect from there once a day." "The British Museum?" Tuppence repeated. "Indeed, popular with tourists, but this ink's fresh. Smells faintly of perfume, doesn't it? Lilac, I'd say." As they stepped out into the street again, Tommy gave a low whistle. "So your mysterious twin is haunting Bloomsbury. Academic, perhaps?" "Or sentimental," said Tuppence. "Either way, she's drawn the curtain back on something, and I mean to see what." She folded the letter carefully into her handbag, as one might conceal a weapon. The London traffic hummed indifferently around them, but Tuppence felt a prickle of anticipation beneath her composure. Somewhere in that city, a woman who wrote like her, and signed herself Margaret, was waiting to be found, and whether the letter was invitation or trap, she had already accepted. "Admit it, Tommy," said Tuppence, tightening the silk ribbon of her hat as they stepped out of the cab. "You don't believe this will lead to anything except a tepid cup of museum tea." Tommy paid the driver and looked up at the British Museum's great stone facade, its columns rearing up like a silent jury. "On the contrary, I've learned to respect your instincts, particularly when they make no sense." It was a mild afternoon, London moving at its usual unhurried tempo. In the courtyard, schoolchildren trailed their teachers like ducklings, and the faint scent of polish drifted from the great doors. Inside, marble floors echoed with the murmur of shoes and whispers. The postal kiosk stood in a narrow passage near the east entrance, its counter manned by a clerk whose moustache looked regulation issue for the reign of Victoria. He eyed the envelope when Tommy showed it to him. "Posted here yesterday afternoon, sir," he said. "Woman in lavender. I recall because she insisted on the exact weight of her letter. Odd, that, for a single sheet." Tuppence leaned in. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, madam, but she had a museum ticket in her glove, so I'd guess she meant to visit the exhibits." "Thank you," said Tommy, tucking the letter away. "You've been most helpful." As they entered the central gallery, the hush of antiquity seemed to press closer around them, the weight of centuries, the breath of dust and stone. A guard nodded them through to the museum cafe, where Tuppence declared they must observe and refresh simultaneously. The cafe was a curious little space, marble tables, a faint smell of coffee, and the sort of dim light that made everyone look slightly historical. Tuppence selected a seat with her back to the wall, from which she could command a view of the room. Tommy was only halfway through his first scone when she froze. "Don't turn your head yet," she whispered. "By the window, the woman in lavender." Tommy shifted his gaze casually toward the reflective teapot lid. A woman sat there, late 50s perhaps, composed but with that fragile air of someone who's been long at war with her own mind. Her dress was a soft lavender shade, the fabric worn at the cuffs. But it was the face that made Tommy pause. She looked like Tuppence, not precisely, a shade older, paler, her features drawn, but enough to startle the imagination. Tuppence, studying her from under the brim of her hat, murmured, "Tommy, it's like looking at a reflection that's begun to fade." The woman's eyes lifted then, meeting Tuppence's across the cafe. Recognition or fear flashed there. For an instant it was as if the two women shared a silent understanding, an echo exchanged. Then, as suddenly, the woman rose, smoothing her gloves, and turned away. "Quickly," Tuppence said, already on her feet. But by the time they reached the corridor, the lavender coat had vanished into the museum's warren of rooms. Tommy, catching up, sighed. "You realize you're chasing yourself." "I'm chasing my ghost," she corrected, "and she's faster than I am." They searched through several galleries, the Elgin marbles, the Assyrian lions, the mummies, but there was no sign of her. Finally, back in the cafe, the waitress pointed to a cup still half full of cold tea. "She left in a hurry," said the girl. "Didn't even touch her cake." On the saucer lay a torn page from a notebook, the paper faintly creased and smelling again of lilac. Scrawled in the same looping hand were the words, "They remember only what suits them." Tuppence read it twice, lips pressed tight. "That's addressed to me," she said softly. Tommy examined it. "And written by you, or your mirror twin. Same pen, same hand. This is getting uncomfortably domestic." A faint pencil note on the margin caught his eye. Gallery 19, 3 p.m. The clock above the counter showed 3:05. They hurried there, hearts quickened, but the gallery stood empty save for a grey-haired curator dusting a glass case of Roman coins. "Excuse me," said Tuppence. "Did a lady in lavender pass this way a few minutes ago?" The curator looked up with mild surprise. "She was here earlier today. Asked the oddest question about our section on psychology and memory. Wanted to know whether we had records from the war. Said she'd lost something important and was trying to remember it properly." "Did she leave her name?" Tommy asked. The curator shook his head. "Only that she once took part in an experiment, something to do with memory restoration. She seemed frightened. I thought perhaps she was unwell." "Did she mention where she was staying?" "No, but she had a visitor's pass dated 2 days ago. I remember because it was the last of that batch." He smiled faintly. "People don't usually come here twice for the same displays." When they stepped out into the hall again, Tuppence's colour had drained. "A memory experiment. Tommy, you heard him. Suppose that letter, 'I remember everything now,' was her way of saying the experiment succeeded?" Tommy frowned. "Or that she was beginning to remember what someone preferred she forgot." They found the admission stub in a waste bin near the cafe entrance, exactly as the curator described. Visitor's pass, valid 2 days. On the back, a faint smudge of lavender powder. Tuppence turned it over in her glove. "She knew we'd come here," she said quietly. "The letter, the postmark, it's all a trail." Tommy slipped the stub into his wallet. "Then let's follow it." But even as he spoke, a strange disquiet hung between them. The museum's marble corridors seemed longer, emptier than before. Every echo of a footstep made Tuppence glance behind her. She felt as though she'd been walking in someone else's dream and might wake at any moment to find it unfinished. They left the museum just before closing. The air outside was cooler, and the street lamps glowed faintly golden in the dusk. Across the street, a lilac-coloured taxi idled briefly before driving off. Tuppence watched it disappear into the stream of London traffic. "She's out there, Tommy, and she wanted me to find her." Tommy offered his arm. "Then we'll oblige her. But next time, I'd prefer our mysteries to involve something less uncanny, like a missing teapot." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You'll change your tune once we've solved this one. There's something dreadfully personal about it. I can feel it in my bones." As they turned the corner, the street lamp's reflection glimmered briefly on the cafe window. Inside, a museum attendant cleared away the last of the cups. The seat by the window was empty now, save for a forgotten lavender glove resting beside the untouched slice of cake. Tuppence never saw it, but the attendant, puzzled, lifted the glove and frowned at the initials stitched inside. M.B. It was the clink of teaspoons and the rustle of the morning papers that began it. Tuppence had taken to watching the front page of the Times as though it might yield an answer by sheer willpower, but this morning she lowered it with a sigh. "Tommy," she said, "if I don't find out who that woman was soon, I shall start introducing myself to strangers just to see if they flinch." Tommy, fastening his cufflinks, smiled faintly. "That would certainly speed up the investigation, though it might also get you arrested." Her reply was cut short by the telephone's insistent ring. Tommy crossed the room and lifted the receiver. "Beresford residence? Yes? Oh, good morning, Inspector Marriott. How's Scotland Yard these days? Still suspicious of taxpayers?" He listened, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You don't say? Amnesia, you say? And a missing woman? Right. Yes, we'll come in." When he replaced the receiver, Tuppence was already halfway into her coat. "I take it we're summoned?" "More like intrigued," Tommy said. "Marriott thinks he's found something that might interest us. Something about a woman called Margaret Lind." The name fell between them like a small, cold coin. Marriott's office at the Yard was much as it had been since 1919, functional, drafty, and littered with paperwork that looked as though it might rebel at any moment. The inspector himself, a solid man with a moustache that belonged to a more heroic age, greeted them with a curt nod. "Good to see you, Beresford. And you, Mrs. B. Heard you've been playing sleuth again." "Purely amateur curiosity," said Tuppence sweetly, "though curiosity, as you know, has excellent instincts." Marriott chuckled and pulled a file from the stack. "This case came across my desk a few months back. Odd business. Man suffering from severe memory loss found wandering near King's Cross. Claimed his name was Charles Armitage. Ex-intelligence officer, served in France during the war. He couldn't remember where he'd been for the past 6 months." Tommy leaned forward. "And the woman?" "Margaret Lind," said Marriott. "Reported missing by her landlady. Lived in a Bloomsbury boarding house. Apparently she and Armitage were, well, friendly. She disappeared the day after he was found. No trace since." "Did he recover?" asked Tuppence. Marriott rubbed his chin. "Not entirely. Doctors said he had episodes of false recognition. Kept mistaking strangers for people from his past. Claimed he'd seen Margaret after her disappearance. Swore she was standing outside his hospital window one night, looking in at him." "That sounds less like delusion and more like plot," said Tuppence under her breath. Marriott flipped open the file and drew out a photograph. "Here's the odd part. One of the nurses said Armitage kept a photo by his bedside. Said it helped him hold on to the truth. That's it there." He slid the picture across the desk. Tommy picked it up and froze. It showed a tall man in uniform standing stiffly beside a woman in a summer dress. The man's expression was solemn, proud. The woman's smile was faint, uncertain. But the face... "Tuppence," Tommy said slowly. "It's you." Marriott frowned. "You know the lady?" Tuppence stared at the photograph, her pulse quickening. "I've never seen it before in my life, but yes, it looks like me." Marriott shrugged. "A coincidence, perhaps? Or a relative?" "I've no relatives who look like me enough to sign my name," she replied, "and certainly none who dabble in mysterious letters." The inspector sat back. "Well, you two always did stumble into the strange ones. If you're interested, the records office at St. Agatha's Hospital still has Armitage's case file, though I can't say you'll find much in it beyond medical jargon." Tommy rose. "Thank you, Inspector. We'll take a look." As they left, Tuppence murmured, "Tommy, either I'm leading a secret double life, or someone's using my face to tidy up theirs." St. Agatha's Hospital occupied a quiet square off Russell Street, its soot-darkened bricks softened by climbing ivy. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of carbolic and overcooked cabbage. A clerk at the records desk, thin, spectacled, with the air of one born to disapprove, listened to their request and pursed her lips. "Armitage, Charles. Yes, I remember. Case files restricted, but I can let you see the summary." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a folder. Tommy scanned the notes aloud. "Subject displays intermittent lucidity, recurrent hallucinations involving familiar faces, claims certain individuals are duplicates of the same person." Tuppence folded her arms. Duplicates indeed. Perhaps he'd met me, or thought he had. The clerk adjusted her spectacles. He was very polite, poor man, always apologized for not remembering where he'd been. One day he looked straight at me and said, "You shouldn't be here, Margaret." I told him my name was Miss Fenton. He smiled and said, "You used to say that too." Gave me quite a turn. Did he mention what caused his memory loss? Tommy asked. Only that someone had put a door in his mind and closed it. Those were his words. Tuppence exchanged a look with Tommy. "A door can be opened," she murmured. The clerk hesitated, then added, "He also said the name Greybrook. Kept asking if it was safe to go back there. Does that mean anything to you?" "Not yet," Tommy said lightly, though he was already making a mental note. As they turned to go, Tuppence's eye caught a label on a shelf. "Discharged Patients, 1948. Among the folders, one bore a red tag. "That one," she said impulsively. The clerk frowned. "Private material, madam." "Of course," said Tuppence, smiling disarmingly. "I only wondered why it's marked red." "Ah, special case. Dr. Melrose's patient. Some controversy about his methods, I believe." The name lodged in Tuppence's mind like a splinter. They left the hospital and found themselves in the late afternoon bustle of Bloomsbury. The hum of buses and bicycles filled the air, but Tuppence was far away in thought. "That photograph," she said finally. "It's not possible, Tommy. I wasn't even in London when that was taken." He nodded. "Still, it's your face, which means either Armitage was mad or someone wanted him to think of you." She shivered slightly. "The woman in lavender, Margaret Lind. Perhaps she was meant to look like me, or I like her. And if she's missing, maybe I'm supposed to replace her." Tommy slipped a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You're letting imagination get ahead of evidence again, old thing." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but imagination is what keeps us alive." They stopped at a tea shop near the square. As the waiter brought their order, Tuppence unfolded the photograph once more. The background behind the pair, Armitage and the woman, showed a garden wall with ivy climbing over a small brass plate. She squinted. "There's writing there. Look." Tommy produced a magnifier from his pocket, a relic of earlier adventures, and tilted the image toward the light. "Greybrook Lane," he read aloud. The same name the clerk had mentioned. Tuppence met his gaze. "Then that's where we go next." Tommy smiled faintly. "And if we find a brass plate with your name on it?" "Then," she said, folding the photo carefully back into her handbag, "I shall start being very polite to myself." Outside, the lamplighters were making their slow rounds. The glow of each lamp flickered to life one by one, steady and deliberate, as if marking steps on a trail that had been waiting for them all along. Neither of them spoke again until they reached the corner, where a poster for a missing person fluttered against the lamppost. The name printed beneath the blurred photograph was Margaret Lind. Tuppence stopped. "Tommy," she whispered, "look at the date. She's been missing for 6 months. He followed her gaze. Since the night Charles Armitage was found. The pieces were beginning to align, but in whose picture neither could yet tell. As the wind stirred the paper, Tuppence's reflection wavered faintly in the shop window beside it, ghosting over Margaret Lind's printed face. For an instant the two women merged, then parted again, and Tommy, watching her expression, thought privately that imagination had very little to do with it. "Greybrook Lane," said Tuppence, unfolding the slip of paper she had copied from Armitage's file. "Number 17. Doesn't that sound deliciously sinister? Almost as if one expects to find a locked room and a helpful butler who refuses to enter after dark." Tommy steered the car along the narrow country road with a wry glance. "Let's hope the butler also makes decent tea. Mystery or not, I'm frozen." The countryside outside London grew quieter mile by mile, the noise of traffic replaced by the steady hum of tyres over damp leaves. The lane itself was narrow, more of a forgotten track than a proper road, its hedges thick and untended. At last, the house emerged through the tangle of ivy and elder, tall, narrow, with shuttered windows like closed eyes. Greybrook House had once been genteel, but time had laid its claim. The gate sagged on one hinge, and a brass plate, dulled to green, still bore the name C. Armitage. Ivy clung to the stone like memory itself, refusing to loosen its grip. Tuppence got out first, closing the car door quietly, as though the place were listening. "If ever there was a house that remembered too much," she murmured, "it's this one." A moment later, the front door opened with a faint creak, and a woman stepped out, thin, grey-haired, wearing a shawl that had once been blue. Her eyes blinked against the daylight. "Good afternoon," Tuppence began brightly. "We're looking for—" But the woman's breath caught. "Miss Lind?" she whispered. "You've come back." Tommy froze halfway up the path, and Tuppence, recovering faster, managed a polite smile. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. My name is Mrs. Beresford." The woman's confusion flickered. Then she laughed softly, the sound brittle as dried leaves. "Oh, of course. You always were fond of your little disguises, but I'd know you anywhere, Miss Margaret. You've the same eyes and that same determined chin." Tuppence exchanged a quick glance with Tommy. "Perhaps you'd allow us inside," she said gently. "We'd love to hear more about Miss Lind." Mrs. Neville, for so she introduced herself, led them through the threshold into a wide hallway where dust motes swirled like memory in sunlight. The air carried the faint scent of lavender polish and something sharper beneath, old smoke perhaps or disuse. "It stood empty in truth since that dreadful night," Mrs. Neville said as she shuffled ahead. "I only came to keep it from going to ruin. But I come twice a week to keep the place from going to ruin. Mr. Armitage was a fine man once, before all the trouble began." "What sort of trouble?" asked Tommy. The caretaker's eyes darted to Tuppence almost apologetically. "Best not speak of it just yet, miss. You've only just come home." They were shown into the parlour, a long shadowed room heavy with old velvet curtains. The piano stood closed, a thin layer of dust on its keys. On the mantel, photographs in tarnished frames stared out blankly. But what caught Tuppence's breath was the portrait above the hearth. A woman in a pale dress, sitting with hands folded, her expression wistful. The resemblance was uncanny. Tommy whistled under his breath. "Well, darling, I always knew you had a twin soul somewhere. I just didn't expect her to hang over a fireplace." Even Mrs. Neville seemed unsettled. "It's strange, isn't it? The likeness. Dr. Melrose said it was the mind playing tricks, that we see patterns where we long to." "Dr. Melrose?" said Tommy sharply. "The gentleman who rented the upper rooms," the caretaker said vaguely. "He and Mr. Armitage were working on some sort of scientific matter, memory and suggestion, I believe. Clever folk, but too clever by half. The brain's not meant to be toyed with." Tuppence moved closer to the portrait. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her, a trick of the varnish and light, yet unsettling all the same. "What happened to Miss Lind?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Neville hesitated, wringing her hands in the corner of her apron. "There was an experiment," she said finally. "Something to do with memory. They said it could make one forget sorrow, replace it with peace. But that night, something went wrong. She ran from the house, screaming that her mind wasn't her own. No one saw her again." A silence fell, broken only by the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. Tommy, ever practical, said, "May we look upstairs? It might help us understand what they were working on." The caretaker nodded, though reluctantly. "It's all locked up, but I suppose Miss Lind would want you to see." She fetched a ring of keys from her apron and led them up a narrow staircase. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the faint metallic scent of neglect. The study door opened with a sigh, releasing a puff of dust. It was a scholar's room turned mausoleum, shelves stacked with medical volumes, charts of the human brain pinned crookedly to the walls. A desk stood in the centre, papers scattered across it, as though their owner had stepped out mid-thought and never returned. Tuppence crossed to it and brushed the dust aside with her glove. A notebook lay open, its title neatly written, "Reconstruction of Memory Through Suggestion, H. Melrose." "Tommy," she whispered. "This is it. The experiment Mrs. Neville mentioned." He scanned a few pages. "Good Lord, listen to this. If the mind can be guided to believe what never occurred, can it not also be guided to forget what did?" "That sounds less like science and more like witchcraft," said Tuppence softly. Among the notes lay a small photograph, a laboratory scene, a man bending over a seated woman whose face was obscured by light. But the woman's hand, resting on the chair arm, wore a distinctive ring. Tuppence lifted her own hand instinctively. The ring on her finger, an heirloom from her aunt, was identical. Tommy saw her expression and muttered, "Coincidence again?" "Or pattern," she replied. "Perhaps the same one Melrose was studying." They moved to the window. The shutters were half closed, but through the slats Tuppence could see the garden below. Overgrown, wild, its paths vanishing into bramble. "She fled that way," Mrs. Neville murmured behind them, "out through the gate and down the lane. I heard her cry once, just once, and then nothing more. Tommy turned to her. And Mr. Armitage? Left soon after. Said he was following her, poor soul. The next I heard, he'd lost his memory altogether. There was something haunted in the caretaker's gaze, as if she too were bound to the house by invisible threads. When they descended again, Mrs. Neville paused at the parlour door. "You'll forgive me for saying so, madam, but seeing you here, it feels like old times returned. I'd almost believe the past could begin again." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Let's hope it chooses a kinder script this time." Outside, the afternoon had darkened toward dusk. As they walked to the car, the ivy whispered faintly in the wind. Tuppence cast one last glance at the windows, still shuttered, still secretive. "There's something waiting in that house," she said quietly, "something unfinished." Tommy started the engine. "Then we'll finish it, but next time I prefer to bring a thermos." As they turned the car around, the crunch of gravel echoed down the lane. For a moment, Tuppence thought she saw movement by the hedgerow, a figure half hidden among the leaves, still as a shadow. Then a stone struck the car window with a sharp crack. Tommy braked, scanning the verge. "Who's there?" he called. Only silence answered. The hedges stood motionless, save for a single branch trembling in the breeze. Tuppence's voice was calm, but her hands were tight in her lap. That wasn't mischief. That was a warning. Tommy shifted into gear, eyes narrowing. Or an invitation. And in the shuttered study above, a loose sheet of paper stirred in the draught, revealing a scrawled line beneath Melrose's signature. "Memory is only truth repeated often enough." Back at Greybrook House, the gramophone needle clicked faintly as it caught the silence between phrases. Then a woman's voice filled the air, measured, calm, unmistakably her own. "I remember the code now. The signal was in the music. Tell him the past can't be buried twice." Tuppence snatched the needle up, heart pounding. The silence that followed seemed to pulse, heavy and alive. It had begun with a lie, a small, reasonable one. She told Tommy she meant to visit Mrs. Neville to return a borrowed handkerchief. In truth, the unease had grown intolerable. The image of the portrait, the smell of lilac, the voice in Mrs. Neville's trembling story, it all coiled in her mind until there was no choice but to return. Tommy had gone to see Inspector Marriott, promising to be back by tea. The moment the door closed behind him, she rang for a taxi. Greybrook Lane lay beneath a slate-grey sky, still and watchful. The house looked unchanged, though perhaps a little more expectant, as if it had known she would come back. Mrs. Neville opened the door with a faint start of recognition. "Mrs. Beresford, I didn't think— well, I wasn't expecting you today." Tuppence smiled. "I found something in my handbag that belongs to you, I think. A key, perhaps." The woman shook her head, but stepped aside all the same. "Come in, pardon me, Mrs. Beresford. The house will be glad of company." Inside, the air was colder. The clock in the hall ticked with uneven rhythm, like a heart skipping beats. Dust drifted faintly through the shaft of light from a cracked window pane. Mrs. Neville fussed with a tea tray. "I'll fetch some hot water. The pipes complain, but they still obey." As soon as her footsteps faded, Tuppence crossed to the drawing-room. It was just as before. The heavy curtains, the faint scent of polish and neglect, the portrait above the hearth that mirrored her features too precisely. But now she saw something new. A writing desk against the far wall. Small, mahogany, its drawers locked tight. She tried the handle. Stubborn. Her eyes darted to the mantel where a key lay under the edge of a photograph frame. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The lock gave easily. Inside were papers, neat but yellowing, and beneath them a stack of small gramophone records wrapped in tissue. Each was labelled in precise handwriting. Session 1, Subject L. Session 2, Induction Session 3, Post-Reconstruction. Tuppence's pulse quickened. Beneath the stack lay a small, portable gramophone, the kind one might carry to the countryside. She set it on the table and wound the handle, her hands trembling slightly. The machine whirred to life with a low hum. When the record began, it was a man's voice first, measured, clinical. Session 3, Subject L. Response interval begins. Question 1. What is the trigger phrase? Then the woman's voice, her voice. "The lilies, always the lilies." Tuppence froze. Question 2. What do you remember? A pause, then that same calm tone. I remember everything now. The room, the music, the code in the waltz. I remember betrayal. And I remember who I was before the war, before they changed the truth. The record crackled, hissed, then cut off abruptly. For a long moment, Tuppence simply stood there, one hand pressed to her throat. The voice had her cadence, her inflection, but not her memory. It was like listening to a stranger wearing her skin. Mrs. Neville's footsteps sounded in the corridor. Tuppence quickly slipped the records back into the drawer, turning the key just as the caretaker entered with the tea. "You look pale, Mrs. Beresford. Are you quite well?" Tuppence forced a smile. "Just a touch of nerves. These old houses feel as though they remember too much, don't they?" Mrs. Neville nodded gravely. "Aye, memories cling longer than wallpaper." They drank tea in the drawing room. Tuppence asked idle questions about Mrs. Neville's life, her years at Greybrook, her employers. The caretaker spoke of Mr. Armitage fondly, of his brilliance, and of Dr. Melrose, always polite but secretive. "He'd work at all hours," she said. "Sometimes I'd hear voices when no one else was here. Recordings," he said. "Experiments." "What sort of experiments?" "Something to do with suggestion," Mrs. Neville said uncertainly. "He said memory could be rearranged like furniture, shifted until it made a prettier picture." Tuppence rose. "I see. Thank you, Mrs. Neville. You've been very kind." The caretaker's eyes followed her anxiously to the door. "If I might say so, Mrs. Beresford, you oughtn't to come here alone. The house remembers you too well." Tuppence smiled faintly. "That's precisely why I came." An hour after they took Tuppence from the roadside and drove her toward the forest, Tommy Beresford was in London having a more official afternoon. Inspector Marriott looked up from his notes. "You've got yourself tangled in something peculiar, Beresford. I've been digging through the archives. During the war, Charles Armitage was attached to an intelligence subdivision. Nothing dramatic, all hush-hush. Coded transmissions, psychological conditioning, that sort of thing." Tommy leaned back. "Conditioning?" Marriott nodded. "They were experimenting with implanted recall patterns, hypnotic cues. The idea was to train agents to remember or forget on command. Nasty business. Melrose was one of the psychologists." "Dr. Henry Melrose?" "The very one. Brilliant by all accounts and completely untrustworthy. After the project was shelved, there were rumours that he continued privately, unofficially. Some of his subjects broke down, claiming they'd been made to remember things that weren't theirs." Tommy whistled softly. "False memories." "Exactly. And one of the last names connected to his work, Margaret Lind." Tommy's expression hardened. So our missing lady wasn't just a patient. She was an experiment. Marriott shrugged. "Either that, or she thought she was. Hard to say. The ministry kept it quiet." Tommy rose, hat in hand. "Thank you, Inspector. You've been as enlightening as always." Marriott gave him a look. "Careful, Beresford. Melrose doesn't like being crossed. People who poke about in his business tend to forget things." Tommy grinned. "I'll take notes then." By the time he returned to Camden Road, the lamps were already lit. The flat smelled faintly of cold tea and paper. Tuppence was seated at the writing table, still in her coat, the faintest trace of dust on her gloves. "Well?" he asked. "What did Mrs. Neville have to say?" She didn't look up. "Very little, but the house had more to tell." Tommy took a closer look. Her face was pale, her eyes too bright. "You went snooping, didn't you?" "I listened to something," she said quietly. "A recording. From that study upstairs. A man asking questions. A voice answering in mine." He blinked. "Your voice?" "Yes. Speaking of codes and betrayal and music that hides messages. Tommy, it was me, and not me." She handed him one of the discs, still wrapped in its paper. The label read Session 3, Subject L. Tommy turned it over carefully. "Melrose," he said. "Has to be." She nodded. He called her, or me, Subject LL for Lind. He was teaching her to recall something she'd forgotten, or perhaps something he wanted her to believe she'd forgotten. Tommy poured a brandy for them both. "Marriott told me Armitage's unit was experimenting with hypnosis, false memories. Melrose was their architect. He must have used Margaret Lind as one of his subjects. But why the resemblance to you?" That's what frightens me, she whispered. Suppose she wasn't just chosen for the experiment. Suppose she was meant to be replaced. He frowned. You mean someone wanted to turn you into her? Tuppence met his gaze. Or convince me I already was. The room felt smaller then, the ticking of the clock loud against the silence. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sliding across the curtains like pale fingers. Tommy moved to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder. We'll find out what happened, old thing. Together. Whatever game Melrose was playing, he's not done yet, and neither are we. Tuppence gave a small, steady nod, but her eyes drifted toward the gramophone disc on the table, where her name, Subject L, seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight. And far away, in the darkened upper room of Greybrook House, the gramophone needle stirred again on its own, scratching faintly as if some ghostly hand had set it back in motion. The voice that emerged was calm, deliberate, and familiar. I remember everything now. The print was still damp when the image began to appear. Under the dim red light of the darkroom, a face slowly surfaced from the chemical haze. A man in uniform, a woman standing beside him, and a third figure at the edge of the frame, half claimed by shadow. Tommy Beresford leaned closer. Good Lord, he murmured. So that's our trinity. The elderly photographer, sleeves rolled to his elbows, gave a shaky chuckle. I haven't developed a plate this old in years. Thought it was ruined, but it seems some ghosts don't fade properly. It had taken Tommy nearly a day to find the man. The name in Armitage's file, J.W. Ransom, often misprinted Ransom, Portrait Studio, Chelsea, had sounded respectable enough, but the shop had long since closed. Only after several wrong turns and a small bribe to a postman did he find the photographer's lodgings above a tobacconist near the river. The man who opened the door was stooped but alert, with a nicotine-stained moustache and eyes that seemed to have seen far too many secrets. "Mr. Ransom," said Tommy, showing his card. "I'm looking into an old commission of yours, a photograph of Charles Armitage and a woman named Margaret Lind." The old man blinked once, twice, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in. That was a long time ago, and an odd job, that one." The flat smelled faintly of photographic chemicals and stale pipe smoke. The walls were lined with frames, portraits of children, soldiers, couples, but dust veiled most of the glass. Ransom settled into a chair and lit his pipe. "She came first," he began. "The woman. Said her name was Miss Lind. Elegant sort, nervous though. Kept glancing at the door as if she expected someone to follow. She wanted the photograph taken with a certain gentleman, but he wasn't to know it was staged." "How do you stage a photograph without someone noticing?" Tommy asked. She'd arranged it all. Said he believed they were there for an official record. She just wanted proof, something to hold on to, she said, before it disappeared. Tommy leaned forward. "Before what disappeared?" "Her past," said Ransom simply. "Those were her words. She told me, they're trying to take it from me, piece by piece. If I have a photograph, they can't make me forget I was real." A shiver traced down Tommy's spine. "She paid in advance," the photographer went on, "and left without waiting for the proofs. Seemed afraid to touch the print when I handed it to her, as though it might burn. I kept the negatives, as I always do. Never heard from her again." "Until now," said Tommy quietly. "And the man beside her was Charles Armitage." Ransom nodded. "Fine soldierly sort. Polite, but you could see he wasn't well. His eyes, a bit lost. Kept calling her by the wrong name, as though she were two women at once." He rose and shuffled to a cabinet, pulling open a drawer filled with envelopes brittle with age. "I kept a few undeveloped negatives from that roll. Exposure errors mostly. But one of them might interest you." Under the glow of the red lamp, Ransom dipped the plate into the solution, humming tunelessly as the shadows bloomed into shapes. Slowly, the third figure took form, a man standing just behind Armitage and Margaret, his face partly hidden by the glare of light on the lens, but his outline clear, tall, formal, watchful. "Recognize him?" Ransom asked. Tommy studied the figure. "I can't see the face properly, but that stance, almost like he's overseeing them." Ransom nodded. "That's what struck me. He wasn't meant to be in the picture. Stepped in just as I took it. She saw him and went white as chalk. Told me afterward, he'll destroy even this." Tommy slipped the photograph into an envelope. "I'll need to take this to a friend at the yard. You've been remarkably helpful, Mr. Ransom. How much do I owe you?" The old man waved a hand. "Just send word if you find out what happened to her. Poor girl deserved better." That evening, Tommy sat opposite Inspector Marriott in a small room at Scotland Yard, the photograph between them. Marriott adjusted his spectacles. "Well, this is a prize find. Let's have a look." He studied it under the desk lamp, then drew in a slow breath. "I'll be damned. That shadowed fellow, I've seen him before." "Where?" "Official photographs from the Intelligence Directorate, 1944. Marriott tapped the blurred outline. "Dr. Henry Melrose, psychological consultant, decommissioned after certain, irregularities. The man's a ghost now, vanished into private practice, but his reputation lingers. Dangerous ideas. Thought he could rebuild minds like clockwork." Tommy whistled. "And Armitage and Margaret were his subjects." "Likely," said Marriott grimly. "Melrose had clearance for an experimental project, Project Persephone they called it, memory induction, emotional reconstruction, all very hush-hush. When it was shut down, he burned most of the records. Some said he continued independently, using volunteers or victims under false names." Tommy pocketed the photograph. "So Margaret Lind wasn't delusional. She really was having her past tampered with." Marriott leaned back. "If Melrose is still at it, he won't like you poking around. Be careful, Beresford." "I'm always careful," said Tommy cheerfully, rising from his chair. "At least until I'm not." Back in Camden Road, Tuppence lay restless in the half-dark, her hair spread across the pillow like a question. Sleep had been reluctant lately, coming only in uneasy fragments. Tonight, it brought her dreams she could not name. She was standing in a white room. The walls gleamed, sterile and bright. A phonograph crackled softly in the corner, the needle tracing a circle. Someone spoke, an indistinct man's voice, calm and firm. "Tell me what you remember." Her own voice answered, low and mechanical. "I remember the door, the garden beyond it, the lilies, always the lilies." Then a sudden pain, a flash of light, and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing like footsteps down a corridor. She woke with a gasp. The room was still. Beside her, Tommy's side of the bed was empty. He had not yet returned. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The faintest scent of lilac drifted through the open window. She pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "The lilies," she whispered. "Always the lilies." Tommy arrived home just after 1, quietly hanging up his coat so as not to wake her. But she was already sitting at the dressing table, her face pale in the lamplight. "You're back," she said simply. "I am." He hesitated. "I saw the photograph developed." "And?" "There was a third person in it, Dr. Henry Melrose." Tuppence turned, eyes wide. Melrose, the name from the notebook. Tommy nodded. Marriott confirmed it. He was Armitage's superior and Margaret's doctor, or rather, her engineer. She rose slowly. "I dreamt of him. I heard his voice. He asked me what I remembered." He frowned. "You're overtired, that's all. You've been thinking of that recording too much." "No, Tommy." Her voice was steady now, but low. "It wasn't imagination. I knew the smell of the room, the sound of the machine, and the lilies. He told me to remember the lilies." He took her by the shoulders gently. "Listen, old thing. You're you. Not Margaret Lind, not some experiment. We're going to stop Melrose before he turns any more lives into puzzles." For a long moment, she looked at him, searching for something solid to hold. Then she exhaled and smiled faintly. "You do make madness sound manageable." "Occupational hazard," said Tommy, with a ghost of his old grin. The next morning brought clarity of purpose, if not of comfort. Over breakfast, Tommy spread out the photograph, the notes, and the gramophone label. "Here's what we know," he said briskly. "Melrose conducted experiments involving memory manipulation. Armitage and Margaret were involved. Armitage lost his memory. Margaret vanished. The recordings we found prove Melrose was still working after the war." Tuppence nodded slowly. "And somehow I've become part of his unfinished story. Perhaps I resemble her. Perhaps he meant me to." "Which makes one question vital," Tommy said. "Why?" Before she could answer, the post arrived. A single envelope, cream paper, faintly scented. The handwriting was hers. She broke the seal with numb fingers. Inside lay a short note typed in precise letters. "If you wish to remember everything, come to Sussex. The lilies are in bloom." No signature. But at the bottom, a small stamped crest. Melrose Clinic, Ashdown Forest. Tommy met her gaze. "Our ghost just sent an invitation." Tuppence folded the letter carefully. Then I suppose it would be rude not to accept. That night, as the wind moved through the trees outside, the photograph on the table caught the lamplight again. In the shadowed corner of the image, where Melrose stood half unseen, the faintest outline of another reflection seemed to form, the suggestion of a fourth figure watching from behind the lens. And though neither of them saw it, the faintest scratch of a gramophone needle began again somewhere far away, repeating a single phrase in a woman's familiar voice. "I remember everything now." "Sussex," said Tommy, eyeing the signpost as they turned off the main road. "Land of orchards, cricket pitches, and, if our luck holds, mad scientists." Tuppence, gazing out of the car window, smiled faintly. "I suppose you'd call that optimism. I call it resignation." The lane wound through gentle hills and copses of beech trees until the hedgerows gave way to an iron gate. A brass plate gleamed on the stone pillar beside it. Dr. Henry Melrose, D.Phil, Psychological Research. "Picturesque," murmured Tuppence. "Even villains need tasteful stationery." The gate swung open of its own accord. Melrose's retreat stood at the edge of Ashdown Forest, a long, low Georgian house with honey-coloured brick and wide French windows that reflected the pale morning sky. There was an impression of quiet precision about the place, like a patient breath held between heartbeats. A manservant in dark livery admitted them with silent efficiency and led them through a corridor lined with modern paintings, blocks of abstract colour, all strangely disorienting. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies. Dr. Henry Melrose awaited them in the drawing-room. He was taller than Tommy had expected, slender, with hair that had gone prematurely white and eyes that seemed always to be observing from a half-step back. His voice was calm, low, precise. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said warmly. "What a pleasure. I understand you've been making rather curious inquiries." "Curiosity is our oldest vice," said Tommy cheerfully. "Ah, but it's a dangerous one," said Melrose, smiling. "Tea?" He poured for them himself, his movements unhurried, each gesture deliberate. The china was immaculate, the teaspoons gleamed. Tuppence watched his hands, the faint tremor that appeared when he set down the pot, the small scar across one knuckle. "You've been asking about a woman," he said conversationally. "Margaret Lind, was it?" Tuppence inclined her head. "Yes. You knew her then?" "I'm afraid not," said Melrose smoothly. "The name is familiar, of course, but I've met many Margarets in my career." His gaze flickered briefly toward her, assessing. "Though now that I see you, Mrs. Beresford, I recall another Margaret entirely. Margaret Beresford, wasn't it?" The cup in Tuppence's hand rattled faintly against its saucer. Tommy looked up sharply. "I beg your pardon?" Melrose smiled benignly. "My mistake, I'm sure. Names have a way of blending together in an old man's memory." But Tuppence saw it. The brief tightening at the corner of his mouth, the satisfaction of a trap subtly sprung. "I quite understand," she said lightly. "Memory is such a tricky thing, isn't it? Never quite what we think it is." His eyes met hers, pale and unreadable. "Ah, but that depends," he said softly, "on who's doing the thinking." When tea concluded, Melrose suggested showing them his study. "My real interest lies in the science of recollection," he explained, "how memory defines identity and how fragile that definition is." He opened the door himself. The room beyond was lined with shelves, books, notebooks, medical charts, and against one wall hung framed diagrams of the human brain, cross-sections annotated in Melrose's fine hand. The atmosphere was subtly oppressive, too still. Tuppence found her gaze drawn to a side table on which lay a series of photographic slides, each labelled with initials, SR, HC, ML. Melrose gestured toward them. "A few of my earlier case studies. Victims of head trauma, amnesia, delusional recall, poor souls who live in yesterday's shadow." He turned to Tommy. "You see, our memories deceive us far more often than we realize. We invent continuity to survive. Remove that thread, and the self unravels." Or can be rewoven, said Tuppence quietly. Melrose's expression didn't change. You've done your reading, Mrs. Beresford. Not many grasp that distinction. Perhaps I've had practice. He regarded her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Indeed, he said at last, you strike me as a woman with an excellent memory, and perhaps one or two you'd rather not have. Tommy laughed lightly. My wife's worst memory is marrying me. The tension loosened. Melrose smiled thinly. Then she remembers wisely. A bell chimed distantly from the hallway. Ah, you'll forgive me, he said. My assistant has just arrived with a parcel of research papers I must sign for. Please, make yourselves at home. You'll find the library through that door, if you prefer something less clinical. As his footsteps receded, Tuppence's composure dropped like a curtain. Tommy, she whispered, did you hear what he called me? Margaret Beresford. I did. I also noticed that tremor when he said it. He's playing a game, but he's not as sure of the rules as he thinks. Her eyes darted toward the desk. Give me 5 minutes. Tuppence. 5, he sighed. Make it 4.5, I'll keep watch. She moved quickly to the filing cabinet by the window. The drawers were labelled meticulously. Memory reorientation, case histories, ML. Her fingers froze on the last one. It was locked. From her handbag she produced a small steel nail file, a veteran of less domestic missions. The lock yielded with a click. Inside were folders bound with ribbon, each bearing initials and dates. She drew one out. ML, Subject B. The pages inside were covered with typewritten notes and margin scrawls in Melrose's hand. Initial reconstruction successful. Memory substitution stable. Identity drift minimal. Secondary subject identified. Facial resemblance optimal. At the bottom of the final page, a line underlined twice. Memory replication successful, awaiting final retrieval. Tuppence's breath caught. The implication was unmistakable. Subject B, herself, had been selected, not by coincidence but by design. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Tommy's discreet cough, his signal. She slipped the top page into her handbag and relocked the drawer just as Melrose re-entered, carrying a small parcel. My apologies, he said smoothly. The postman insists on signatures these days. Bureaucracy never forgets, however much we might wish it to. He looked from one to the other, faint amusement in his gaze. You've been exploring, I see. A dangerous habit, Mrs. Beresford. Tuppence smiled. Oh, I merely admired your diagrams. You have a gift for neat handwriting. His eyes glinted. I find clarity essential. Disorder breeds confusion, and confusion breeds false memory. Tommy set down his teacup. Then I dare say you must keep a very tidy conscience. Melrose's mouth curved. Conscience is another form of memory, Mr. Beresford. Selective, self-serving, and, if one's clever, erasable. A silence followed, taut as wire. Then he clapped his hands lightly. Well, I mustn't detain you from your pleasant drive back to London. You've both been most stimulating company. They left under the courteous supervision of the manservant, who bowed them out with mechanical precision. When the car reached the road, Tommy exhaled. Well, we've met our mad scientist, and you've stolen his sheet music. Tuppence held up the folded page. One line of truth, Tommy. Enough to prove we're not chasing ghosts. But I'd say he knows we're on to him. I'd say he's planning what to do about it. She glanced back toward the house. In one of the upstairs windows, a figure stood watching, a pale blur against the glass. Drive faster, she said. The road out of Ashdown Forest was narrow, bending through tall trees that arched overhead like ribs. Twilight had deepened, the first stars flickered through the branches. Tuppence reread the page by the light of the dashboard. Memory replication successful, awaiting final retrieval. Her voice trembled on the last word. What does that mean, retrieval? Could mean anything, said Tommy. Perhaps he planned to extract something from his subjects, information, confession, or identity, she said softly. To take one mind and pour it into another. Armitage, Margaret, and me. Then we'll make sure he never gets the chance. A pair of headlights appeared behind them, distant but steady. Tuppence glanced in the mirror. Someone's following. Tommy checked. Probably a local. Roads like these, no other route back to town. But the lights grew closer, too close, glaring white in the mirror. The other car drew up beside them on a straight stretch. For a heartbeat, Tuppence saw the driver's face, a featureless silhouette behind dark glass. Then the car swerved sharply toward them. "Tommy!" He jerked the wheel, the tires screamed. Gravel spat from the verge. The other car was gone, only the fading taillights receding into the distance. Tommy scrambled round to her side, but a second car, darker without lights, slid up behind them. Two men in clinic coats jumped out with a stretcher. "Head injury," one said briskly. "We'll get her to the doctor on the estate." Tommy stepped in front of them. "I'll come with her." "Not you, sir," the other said. "You need checking yourself. Another car's coming." Before Tommy could argue, they had Tuppence up and in the back. The doors slammed, and the car shot away toward the forest, leaving him on the verge with a stalled engine and a useless promise of another car. Tommy swore once, savagely, then turned for London and for Marriott. "Deliberate," he muttered. "They wanted us off the road." Tuppence leaned against the car, her hands trembling. "Then we must have something they want back." She opened her handbag and drew out the folded page. The paper had torn slightly at the crease, but the words were still legible. "Memory replication successful, awaiting final retrieval." Tommy met her eyes. "Then we'd better find out what exactly he means by final, before we forget how." Far off, through the trees, a faint glimmer of light appeared, perhaps from Melrose's house, perhaps from something else entirely. But as the wind shifted, the scent of lilies reached them again, faint and unmistakable. Tuppence shivered. "He's not finished with us, Tommy." Tommy helped her back into the car, his jaw set. "Then we won't be finished with him." He turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught. The car rolled back onto the road, its headlights slicing the darkness ahead. Behind them, unseen, a shadow stepped from the trees and watched until their lights vanished beyond the bend. Then it moved soundlessly toward the crumpled verge and retrieved a scrap of torn paper fluttering in the wind. One corner of the note remained legible beneath the dirt. "Subject B confirmed. Retrieval imminent." The world came back to her in pieces. First, the smell, antiseptic and lilac soap, mingling faintly with the metallic tang of something sterilized. Then the sound, the steady tick of a clock, a whisper of rubber soles on linoleum. Finally, light, thin and clinical, slicing through half-closed eyelids. Tuppence stirred. Her throat ached. The sheets felt rough, institutional. When she tried to move, a dull pain pulsed through her left arm, wrapped tightly in bandages. She opened her eyes fully. A white ceiling, a curtain drawn halfway round her bed, a glass of water on the side table, untouched, and a nurse. "Ah, you're awake." The woman's tone was professional but distant. "Try not to move too much. You've had quite a shock." "Where am I?" "Melrose Clinic, Sussex," said the nurse. "You were brought in from the accident. Doctor said you were to be admitted at once." Tuppence's voice was hoarse. "My husband, Mr. Beresford, was with me. Is he—" The nurse shook her head. "There was no one else brought in with you, Mrs." She hesitated, then smiled too smoothly. "Mrs. Lind." Tuppence stared. "That's not my name." "Of course," said the nurse indulgently. "Rest now, doctor. Melrose will see you presently." Memory came in snatches. The curve of the road, headlights behind them, the sudden screech of tires. Then nothing but silence and darkness. Tommy's voice shouting her name, or was that part of the dream? She sat up slowly. Her clothes were gone, replaced by a patient's gown. The clock on the wall showed 3:10. A faint hum filled the air, low, mechanical. Somewhere a door opened and closed with a soft click. Footsteps approached. When the curtain drew back, she expected the nurse. Instead, a tall figure in a white coat stood before her, his expression composed, his voice modulated to a perfect calm. "Good afternoon, Margaret," said Dr. Henry Melrose. Tuppence felt the world tilt slightly. "That isn't my name," he smiled gently. "You've said that before." "I'm Mrs. Beresford," she insisted. "Where is my husband?" Melrose pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, folding his hands. "There is no Mr. Beresford, Margaret. You've constructed him as part of your recovery, a projection of guilt and longing. It's common in cases of identity fragmentation." Her pulse quickened. "That's nonsense." "Is it?" His tone remained soft, persuasive. "You were part of Operation Persephone, do you remember? The Ministry's experiment to test cognitive reconfiguration under field pressure. You and Charles Armitage were the final subjects." Tuppence shook her head. "I've never heard of it." He leaned forward, eyes kind and searching. "Try. You were brilliant, one of our finest recruits. But when the experiment failed, you rewrote the past to protect yourself. You imagined a husband, a quiet domestic life, trivial adventures, all comforting illusions." Her breath caught. "You're lying." "I'm helping you," said Melrose gently. "Think. The name Beresford, where did it come from? It's your own creation, a combination of memory fragments. Bear from Beresford Hall, the estate where Persephone was conducted. Ford, a crossing, a passage between realities. It's how your mind hid the trauma." She felt dizzy. His words slid into her thoughts like threads pulling loose fabric apart. "You're very clever," he murmured. "You built an entire world out of longing. But it's time to remember who you are." He gestured toward a clipboard at the foot of her bed. "Your file confirms it. Margaret Lind, Subject B." She turned her face away. "Where is Tommy?" Melrose sighed. "The man you imagine is a composite, a safety mechanism. Every time I mention the truth, you invoke him like a talisman. But he isn't real, Margaret. He never was." Her throat tightened. "That's not true. I remember." He smiled faintly. "Do you? Or do you remember what you've been told to?" For the next hour, she sat beneath the steady rhythm of his voice as he guided her through a labyrinth of questions, each one designed to dismantle her certainty. "Who first called you Tuppence?" "My husband." "His full name?" "Thomas Beresford." "And where did you meet?" "At—" She hesitated. The memory was there, vivid but suddenly slippery. "At the intelligence office during the war." Melrose's pen scratched lightly on the paper. "Convenient, isn't it? Another tie to your fabricated identity as an agent. The mind is an excellent storyteller." She gripped the edge of the blanket. "You can't make me doubt him." He rose, pacing slowly beside her bed. "I don't have to. Your mind is already questioning itself. That's progress." He turned back, his expression softening. "You can let go now. The guilt isn't yours. The failure of the operation wasn't your fault. Armitage died because he resisted the reconstruction. You tried to save him, but you couldn't. You've punished yourself with fantasy ever since." Tuppence pressed her palms against her temples. "Stop it. Only when you remember." He moved closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Say the words, Margaret. I remember everything now." The phrase hit her like a spark. Her mind jolted backward, past his voice, past the sterile room, to another time, another place. The letter on her writing desk, the lavender scent, the handwriting that matched her own. "I remember everything now." No, that was what the letter had said. The trap. And suddenly she knew. Her eyes flew open. "You used that phrase before." Melrose blinked. "What?" "The letter, the recordings. It's your trigger phrase. You've been trying to rewrite me, replace one Margaret with another. But it isn't working." His calm cracked, if only for an instant. "You don't understand what you are, Mrs. Beresford." "Oh, but I do." Her voice was clear now, cold. "I'm the woman you tried to duplicate, and failed. The experiment ended, but you couldn't bear the failure. So you found me, someone who looked like your missing subject, and decided to finish your work." Melrose's expression hardened. "You're confused. The sedation is wearing off too quickly." He reached for the bedside cabinet, opening a small case of syringes. Tuppence moved faster. She grabbed the glass of water and flung it into his face. The shock made him stumble. She yanked the IV line from her arm, tearing the tape loose, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, quiet except for the rhythmic squeak of a distant trolley. She darted through the first open door she saw, a linen closet, and listened. Melrose's voice carried faintly from the ward. "Seal the exits. She's disoriented. No one is to let her leave." The tone was gone. It was no longer the soothing doctor's cadence, but command, clinical and precise. She waited until his footsteps retreated, then slipped barefoot along the corridor. The nurse's station stood ahead, empty save for a lamp and a ringing telephone. A clipboard lay on the counter. She snatched it up. Patient file, Lind Margaret, subject B, observation under hypnotic recall. Beneath it, attending physician, Dr. H. Melrose. At the bottom, one final line, awaiting final retrieval. Her breath hitched. A door banged somewhere down the hall. Time was running short. She ran, ignoring the ache in her arm, until she reached a stairwell marked fire exit. The alarm was disconnected. Someone had anticipated her, but she pushed through anyway. Cold air struck her face like freedom. She stumbled down the steps into a gravel courtyard lit by a single lamp. The night was damp, the forest looming dark beyond the fence. For a heartbeat she thought she heard footsteps behind her. Then, Tuppence! The voice was real, blessedly, impossibly real. She turned. Tommy was running toward her, coat flapping, a flashlight in his hand. Behind him, a heavier tread. Inspector Marriott, his expression grim. "Thank heaven," Tommy breathed, catching her arm. "I thought, well, never mind what I thought." She clung to him, dizzy with relief. "He said you weren't real." Marriott's jaw tightened. "We had a devil of a time finding this place. Private registration, false staff records. The clinic's a front. Melrose must have built the whole operation out here after the ministry shut him down." Tommy glanced back toward the building. "Where is he?" But the doorway was empty. Only the faint hiss of wind through the trees answered. They led her to the car waiting at the edge of the drive. The headlights cut through the mist as Marriott spoke quietly into his radio. "We'll send a team to search the premises. For now, we get her out." Tuppence sank against Tommy's shoulder. "He tried to make me believe you were part of my imagination." Tommy squeezed her hand. "You should have known that was impossible. I've never been subtle enough for imagination." She gave a small, weary laugh. "He called me Margaret. Said the name Beresford was something I'd invented. Operation Persephone. Does that mean anything to you?" Marriott turned from the front seat. Persephone was Melrose's original project, code for memory transference. They said it was abandoned, but I'd wager he continued in secret. Your resemblance to Margaret Lind must have been too tempting for him to resist. Tuppence closed her eyes. "He wanted to finish what he started, to overwrite me with her." Tommy kissed her temple gently. "He underestimated you. You're far too stubborn to be rewritten." The car bumped along the lane toward the main road. Behind them, the clinic lights glimmered faintly through the trees. Then, one by one, they flickered out. Half an hour later, in the safe glow of the local constabulary office, Tuppence sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea that tasted faintly of tinned milk and rescue. Marriott stood beside the window, dictating to a stenographer. "No trace of Melrose or his staff," he said. "Records removed, patient files destroyed. But we have the fragment from the cabinet, enough to confirm illegal experimentation under the Persephone Protocol." Tommy turned to Tuppence. "Are you certain you're all right?" She nodded slowly. "Just tired. But it's strange, Tommy. While he spoke, part of me almost believed him. His certainty was so absolute." He smiled softly. "That's how liars win, old thing. They tell the story you already half fear." She leaned back, eyes heavy. "And what do you suppose his final retrieval meant?" Marriott turned from the window. "We think he intended to extract her implanted memories from one subject and transfer them to another, an attempt at psychological immortality. If so, Mrs. Beresford, you were next in line." "Lucky me," she murmured. Outside, dawn was just beginning to pale the horizon. The first light crept across the floorboards, catching the edge of a torn scrap lying on Marriott's desk. Tuppence picked it up. A single sentence typed and underlined. "If the memory is strong enough, it survives the mind that held it." She set it down quietly. "Then perhaps he's not gone," she said. Tommy met her gaze. "No," he said, "but next time he remembers us, we'll be ready." She smiled faintly, exhaustion tugging at her edges. "I suppose we'll have to, won't we?" "Indeed." He rose, straightened his tie, and offered her his arm. "Come along, Mrs. Beresford. You've had enough of hospitals for one lifetime." She took it, steadying herself, and together they stepped into the first clean light of morning, two figures walking away from the ruins of another person's dream. And somewhere, deep in the quiet forest behind them, a gramophone needle dropped onto a record, spinning once more to life. A woman's voice, calm and composed, spoke into the silence. "I remember everything now." Look at it this way, said Tommy, pouring coffee with a steadier hand than he felt. If we're both figments of some lunatic's imagination, we might as well be well-fed ones. Tuppence gave him a wan smile across the breakfast table. You're cheerful for a man who nearly became a psychological experiment. Defiance, my dear, he said lightly. It's the British cure for existential tampering. But the humour didn't quite hold. The morning light slanted through their London flat, catching the thin film of dust that had settled while they'd been gone. Outside, a milk cart rattled down the street, a reminder that the world carried on perfectly happily, even when your identity had been up for auction. Marriott arrived not long after, looking more harried than usual, hat tucked under one arm and a stack of papers in the other. He wasted no time. We've examined what's left of Melrose's clinic, he said, dropping into a chair. Most of the files were destroyed, but we've pieced enough together. It's worse than we thought. Tuppence leaned forward. Tell us. Melrose wasn't just tinkering with memory recall, said Marriott grimly. He developed a method to overwrite identity, implanting suggestive triggers into susceptible minds. The goal was to erase guilt, reshape loyalty, rewrite entire lives. His wartime research was buried when it became clear the process drove most subjects mad. Tommy whistled softly. And Margaret Lind? She was his first success, said Marriott. For a time, at least. Her conditioning held until she realized what had been done to her. She fled before the final phase, the retrieval, as he called it. Melrose's notes suggest he needed a control subject to compare results, someone resembling her physically and intellectually. Me, said Tuppence quietly. Marriott nodded. The letter, the perfume, the cafe encounter, and the forced admission to his clinic, all staged to make you doubt yourself, to trick your mind into reliving Margaret's programmed past. Melrose wanted to see if he could reconstruct an identity from fragments. Tommy frowned. And that's what he meant by the memory key. Some kind of physical anchor for the conditioning? Precisely, said Marriott. His records mention a gramophone disc, the final piece of the puzzle. If he still has it, he can restart the process. Tuppence stared at her reflection in the teacup. Familiar, steady, but faintly estranged. He said I was her, that Tommy was an invention to cover my guilt. Well, said Tommy, forcing cheer into his tone, if I'm imaginary, I must say you've given me splendid dialogue. She smiled faintly. We'll need more than wit this time. He's clever, and he'll come back to finish it. Marriott stood. Then we bring him to us. You said his first contact with you was at the museum cafe. Yes, said Tuppence. That's where I saw the woman, Margaret or whoever she was, and where Melrose's people first observed me. Tommy nodded. Then that's where we'll stage his finale. Let him believe the game's still working. The next afternoon, the British Museum cafe hummed with the ordinary rhythm of teacups and mild academic chatter. Through the tall windows, sunlight filtered across marble floors and rows of seated patrons. At a corner table, Tuppence sat alone, a lavender scarf knotted at her throat, the same shade as the mysterious woman's dress weeks before. She stirred her tea, outwardly calm. In her handbag lay a small transmitter wired to the receiver in Tommy's pocket. Marriott and two plainclothes officers waited by the entrance, pretending interest in the pastry selection. Tommy's voice crackled softly in her ear. He's late, or fashionably mad. Patience, she murmured, lips barely moving. He likes control. He'll want to arrive at the perfect psychological moment. She didn't have to wait long. At precisely 3 o'clock, Dr. Henry Melrose entered the cafe. He wore a light grey suit and carried a leather case. His expression was mild, courteous, detached, as though the events in Sussex had been a minor misunderstanding over tea. He saw her immediately. "Margaret," he said warmly, approaching. "I was hoping you'd come." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You were rather persuasive." He sat opposite her, placing the case carefully on the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. "My methods were abrupt but necessary. The mind resists its own healing." "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Perhaps you were right. I have memories, fragments I can't explain. A voice, a laboratory, lilies." She hesitated, letting the tremor show in her voice. "Maybe you can help me finish remembering." Melrose's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "Yes, that's all I've ever wanted, to help you remember." He opened the case. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a small gramophone disc. The label was handwritten, Session Yo, Key Sequence. This is the final piece, he said. The memory key. Without it, the conditioning decays. With it, the old sequence runs perfectly. Tuppence's pulse quickened. Margaret's voice. Your voice, corrected Melrose gently. Listen, and you'll understand. He took a portable player from the case, sleek, modern, far smaller than the old devices in Greybrook Lane, and set the disc spinning. The cafe's clatter seemed to fade. From the tinny speaker came a faint crackle, then a woman's voice, calm, melodic, eerily familiar. I remember the garden. I remember the code. I remember what they made me forget. Melrose leaned forward, eyes fixed on Tuppence. Say it with her. She stared at the table. I remember. Yes, he urged. Go on. Her voice steadied. I remember that you lied to me. Melrose froze. The cafe doors burst open. Marriott and his men moved swiftly, one intercepting the exit while the other closed in behind Melrose's chair. Dr. Henry Melrose, said Marriott crisply, you're under arrest on charges of unlawful psychological experimentation, abduction, and assault. Melrose's composure cracked for the first time. You fools don't understand. I was creating perfection, proof that memory transcends the body. Margaret lived on. Through someone else's life, said Tuppence quietly. He turned on her, eyes blazing. You were Margaret. You still are. Every choice, every phrase, the experiment worked. Then why did you have to remind me? She said softly. He hesitated, the certainty faltering. Because, Marriott snapped handcuffs round his wrists, because you failed. The gramophone still played, its crackle filling the stunned silence. The voice on the disc continued, soft and steady. If you remember, you will die. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The officers exchanged glances. What the devil does that mean? Tommy muttered, joining Tuppence at her side. Melrose smiled faintly, almost pitying. It means she carries the same trigger as Margaret Lind. Memory and identity cannot coexist when both are overwritten. The moment she truly recalls everything, her mind will collapse under the weight of contradiction. Marriott's jaw tightened. Enough of your theatrics. He signalled to an officer who stopped the recording, but Tuppence stood very still, the words echoing through her. Tommy took her arm. Come on, old thing, he's bluffing. She nodded slowly. Perhaps, but if he isn't, the experiment's still running, in me. Melrose's eyes glinted as they led him away. You'll see soon enough. Memory is the cruelest truth of all. That evening, back at their flat, the gramophone disc sat on the table between them. Marriott had allowed them temporary custody for psychological closure, though he'd made it clear it would soon go into evidence. Tommy poured 2 whiskies. You don't have to listen again, he said gently. I know. But she stared at the disc, its label a hypnotic spiral of ink and light. What if he's right, she whispered. What if Margaret's memories are buried in me, waiting? Tommy reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Then we'll face them together, as we always do. She smiled faintly. Do you ever worry that we've had too many adventures, Tommy, that we've used up all our luck? Never, he said firmly. We've only borrowed it, and we always pay it back, with interest. She laughed softly, tension easing. A banker's son to the end, he grinned. Exactly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Then, almost impulsively, Tuppence reached out and set the needle gently on the record. The crackle returned. The familiar voice spoke once more. I remember the garden. I remember the code. Tuppence closed her eyes. I remember everything now. The voice faded. The room was silent. Tommy watched her carefully. Well? She opened her eyes and smiled, calm, steady, utterly herself. I remember that I'm Tuppence Beresford, she said, and that's quite enough for one lifetime. He exhaled. You gave me a fright. Good, she said lightly. Keeps you humble. Outside, London moved on. The murmur of traffic, the distant chime of St. Pancras. The world was real again, solid beneath their feet. Tuppence lifted her glass. To remembering just enough, she said. Tommy clinked his against hers. And to forgetting the rest. The record turned silently to its end. the needle caught in a faint, endless loop, a whisper that might have been static, or perhaps the last trace of a woman who had once tried to rewrite the past. The lane was narrower than they remembered. Summer had softened its edges, ivy curling over the broken wall, nettles reclaiming the drive. Greybrook House stood as before, but gentler now in its decay, as if the years had finally loosened their grip on whatever secrets had been held too tightly within its walls. A sign had been posted near the gate. Auction notice. Contents and fixtures. "End of an era," said Tommy, closing the car door, "or at least of one man's particularly nasty hobby." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost sentimental." They walked up the path together. The windows, long shuttered, had been thrown open to the light. 2 workmen were hauling out old furniture, a cracked settee, a bureau missing its handles. The smell of dust and wood polish mingled with the warm air. Mrs. Neville, still caretaker until the sale was complete, appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron, her face lit with recognition. "Well, if it isn't the Beresfords. I hoped you'd come before it's all gone. Poor Miss Lind would be glad, I think." Tuppence hesitated. "You knew her well, didn't you?" "As much as anyone did," said Mrs. Neville. "Kind soul, but burdened. Used to say her thoughts weren't her own sometimes. Gave me shivers, that did." Tommy gave a sympathetic nod. "We've felt the same once or twice lately." The woman chuckled softly. "I'll leave you to look around. The study's just as it was. I couldn't bring myself to touch it." She left them in the echoing hallway. Dust floated in slow spirals through the shafts of sunlight that pierced the air. The grandfather clock, long stopped, stood like a sentry by the stair. Tuppence's hand brushed Tommy's arm. "Let's finish it properly," she said. The study was smaller than they'd remembered, shabbier too. Time had dimmed its menace, replacing it with a kind of weary melancholy. The neurological diagrams still hung on the walls, curling at the corners. The desk stood in the same place, a faint outline marking where something heavier had once rested atop it. Tommy crossed to the fireplace. "So this is where it began." Tuppence nodded. "And where it should end." She moved toward the desk, fingertips grazing the surface. The drawers had been emptied, all but one. When she tugged, it resisted. "Locked," she murmured. Tommy arched a brow. "You seem to have developed a talent for those lately." "Practice," she said dryly. A quick probe with her nail file, a satisfying click, and the drawer slid open. Inside lay a small wooden box, simple and unlabeled. Tuppence lifted it carefully onto the desk. "Feels almost theatrical, doesn't it?" Tommy folded his arms. "If a ghost is about to leap out, let's hope it's at least polite." She turned the tiny key that had been left beside it. The lock gave way, revealing a single object wrapped in faded silk, a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. The initials were embossed faintly on the front, M.L. "Margaret Lind," whispered Tuppence. She opened it cautiously. The handwriting within was small, delicate, pages of neat entries interspersed with hurried, desperate scrawls. "January the 3rd. Dr. Melrose believes memory can be unmade like a garment. I volunteered because forgetting seems mercy. I told him I could not bear the faces, the orders, the signature on the paper that cost them their lives." Tuppence read on, her voice barely above a whisper. "February 10th. The sessions begin. He says the past is a wound that can be stitched shut. Yet each time I leave, I remember less of who I am. My reflection looks back like a stranger." She turned another page. March 22nd. He calls it success. I call it silence. I no longer recall what I wish to forget, but neither do I recall what I loved. Perhaps this is peace, or punishment. The last entry was a single line. Yard had already copied Melrose's surviving notes. Nothing here would change his fate. If memory is life, then what am I now? Silence fell. Tommy rubbed his chin. So that was her reason. She wanted to forget her betrayal, not knowing she'd lose herself entirely. Tuppence closed the diary, and Melrose turned her tragedy into research. He called it progress. "Most villains do," said Tommy. She set the diary down, staring at the hearth. "I can't leave it here. If someone else finds it, they'll print her misery in a paper, or worse, turn it into another experiment." Tommy's voice softened. "What do you suggest?" She looked toward the fireplace. "We give her what she wanted. Oblivion." He nodded once. Fitting. She struck a match. The flame trembled briefly, then steadied. Setting it to the corner of the diary, she watched as the paper caught, slow at first, then quickening, the ink curling and vanishing into gold-edged ash. For a moment the room seemed to breathe, lighter, as though something long held had been released. When only embers remained, she spoke quietly. Perhaps remembering isn't always the virtue we think. Tommy poured the last of the tea they'd brought in a flask and handed her a cup. In that case, he said, let's forget the whole thing, starting with lunch. I've been heroic far too long on an empty stomach. Tuppence smiled. What would you call heroic? Unlocking a drawer or watching me do it? I provide moral support, he said solemnly, and commentary. They left the study together, stepping into the sunlight filtering through the cracked panes. Outside, a robin perched on the garden wall, singing into the warm air as if to remind them that ordinary life had already resumed. At the gate, Tuppence turned for one last glance. The house looked peaceful now, just a shell of brick and ivy, stripped of ghosts and experiments. Do you think it's really over? She asked. Tommy tilted his hat. For Melrose, yes. For us, until the next lunatic writes our names on a file. She laughed softly. And we'll probably read it, just to see what happens. Exactly. Curiosity, my dear Tuppence, is our worst virtue. As they climbed into the car, she glanced back once more. A breeze stirred the ashes in the fireplace, scattering them like faint grey petals. Goodbye, Margaret, she murmured. Tommy started the engine. Right. Now, how do you feel about roast beef and a pint somewhere with no laboratories attached? Positively restored, she said. The car rolled down the lane, sunlight flashing through the trees, the house shrinking behind them into a quiet silhouette. And as they drove away, laughter, honest human healing, drifted out through the open window, mingling with birdsong and the easy hum of the countryside. The ghosts of Greybrook Lane were gone at last.